Hi, hello everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario on behalf of webyeshiva.org. We are studying the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, and we had just started chapter 39 of the third section of the guide. We're quite far along in our study of the guide, but fortunately there are a series of recordings that any person who wishes to start from the beginning or start from the middle can catch up on. There is a podcast, Moreh Nevukhim, with Rabbi Daniel Karapkin that you can easily find on most platforms. It's on the Bayit YouTube channel. And also, we encourage everyone to sign up for the Facebook group, Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, where you can download our weekly handouts and get updates about Shiur, about when Shiur is taking place. So let's get our bearings. I'll share my screen with you so that you can see everything is fully outlined today. We began chapter 39 with the assertion that most of the agricultural laws related to tithing were given by God to instill pity for the weak and the wretched, giving strength in various ways to the poor, and inciting us not to press hard upon those in straits. So what the Rambam is doing, just recall his project, is that he's divided the mitzvot since chapter 35. He's divided the mitzvot into 14 separate categories. And he says that each of these categories of mitzvot contribute to the overall objective of why God gave us a Torah with commandments. Each and every one of the 613 commandments helps a human being become a perfected individual. And the way that you become a perfected individual is ultimately by perfecting your intellect and knowing as much about God as you possibly can. But there are many ways that are, and many prerequisites that are necessary in order to get there. Number one, a person has to have moral virtue in order to be able to be motivated to properly think about God. So therefore, many of the mitzvot are there to promote moral virtue. And that's not only moral virtue within the individual, but moral virtue within the society where I find myself living, so that I can be free of hassle and disturbance, which in turn enables me to focus my attention upon my ultimate objective, which is perfecting my intellect to think about God properly. So therefore, this entire category, this is category 4, is a set of commandments primarily to be found in Hilchot Zeraim, the laws of agriculture, in the Mishneh Torah. And these laws focus on instilling man with proper moral virtue of having pity and compassion upon those less fortunate, because it contains many of the commandments of tithing and of providing for the other. Okay? Furthermore, by promoting parting with our assets and giving them to others, we weaken the appetite for eating and acquisition. The side benefit of being charitable and being compassionate to those less fortunate is that it also removes and diminishes our lusts and appetites for consumption. And that's again promoting moral virtue within man. So far, we have discussed general tithes for the poor. So we had just covered the first page, pages 550 and 551, down to the bottom of the page in the Pines edition. We've discussed general tithes for the poor in the Levite, Maaser Sheni, the second tithe brought for consumption in Jerusalem, and Neta Ravai, produce of the fourth year of a tree's growth, which also the produce has to be brought up to Jerusalem. In the ensuing mitzvot, we will discover other benefits that arise from the commandments to tithe and to donate and to provide for others. Some of these go well beyond Hilchot Zeraim, the laws of agriculture, and have to do with other laws such as lending money and dedicating things to the temple, but they all fall under this category of engendering this moral virtue of generosity and parting with our assets. So We're continuing down the list until we get to the end of the chapter today. The next mitzvah that we're going to see that is part of this category is the mitzvah of bikurim, of first fruits. In addition, so what does a person do? It actually takes place around this time of year, around Shavuot, where a person is commanded to identify the first fruits, the first produce that's growing on his tree, because this is typically the time of harvesting tree produce, tying a ribbon around it even when it's in its immature state, waiting for it to ripen, and then taking the first growths from his orchard, placing them in a basket, and bringing them to Jerusalem. It typically would be brought with you when you came to do your pilgrimage for the Shavuot holiday, and you would present the basket to the Kohen in the temple. And the purpose of this mitzvah is that in addition to weakening man's appetite for consumption by compelling him to donate the first of his fruits, it also promotes the moral quality of humility. And in what way? This is manifest in the way the person brings the bikurim, because the Mishnah dictates that he should bring the basket on his shoulders, showing that he's merely just a servant to the God that he serves, presenting him with gifts in a very humbly positioned way. And what is the humility that is supposed to be engendered? As we'll see, I recognize that I am not the architect and master of my own destiny, but rather it is only because of God's good graces that I have been blessed with so much bounty. Furthermore, this mitzvah causes a person to acknowledge the good that God has done for him, because, as we'll see, part of the acknowledgement that I make when I bring my first fruits is not only that God has blessed me with this produce, but that there was a period of privation before I had all of the blessings. And by contrasting that period of privation that existed in my life or in my people's lives before I had all of this blessing, I can now appreciate the gifts that God has given to me all that much more. So this is an essential part of divine worship, to remember our troubled past during times of prosperity and to thank God for his intervention in our lives. This is reflected several times in the Torah, as the Torah says in reiterating the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy. The reason for Sabbath, one of the reasons for Sabbath observance is v'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. Remember how you were a slave in Egypt, and you didn't have the opportunity to have respite and rest on a day of Sabbath. And God took you out of Egypt, and now he has given you this Sabbath day, and so you have to show gratitude for the tremendous blessing that you possess, especially in light of the fact that you can recall when there was a time when you didn't have that blessing. Acknowledging God's grace is especially important to do in times of prosperity, since, as the Rambam writes, there is a natural tendency for wealth to corrupt one's moral fiber, producing feelings of conceit, vanity, and the neglecting of intellectual speculation. That's a very important line. It's not just because you're going to become a jerk, if you'll allow me to use the vernacular, through your wealth. But it's even more important that when a person becomes wealthy, they become self-indulgent, and they also neglect that ultimate responsibility and objective, which is to become intellectually perfected. So that's the reason why it is so important to have this humility when a person is the beneficiary of great wealth in Eretz Yisrael. And this mitzvah of bikurim helps to humble the individual, helps to refocus him to recognize that there was a time when he had nothing, and so he should not become so full of himself just because he has acquired wealth. And this is reflected multiple times in the Torah. The Torah says, pentochal v'savata, in Deuteronomy once again. You may consume and become sated, and you'll build beautiful homes in Eretz Yisrael, and you'll have a lot of livestock, and you'll have a lot of gold and silver, and everything that you seek will be fulfilled. And then what will be the end product in verse 14? Viram levavecha. Your heart will become haughty. V'shachachta et Hashem Elokecha. And you'll forget the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. Another verse from Deuteronomy 32, from the famous Ha'azinu song. Vayishman Yeshurun Vayivat, and Jeshurun, a name for the Jewish people, became fat and started to kick or rebel against God. And Vayitosh Elo Ka'asahu, they forsake the God who made them, Vayinabel Tzur Yeshuato, and they treated horribly the rock of their salvation. This is precisely the reason why the Torah commands the bringer of Bikurim to recite a passage while he's in the temple in the presence of God's Shekhinah. So while you're presenting your fruits to the Kohen, you place the produce down and then you recite a passage. And the passage that you recite, the Rambam doesn't cite it here, but I have it for you in the outline of the shir today. It's a very famous passage, and the reason why it's famous is because we recite it every year in the Haggadah at our Passover Seder. And it says that a person has to actually explicitly remember his humble origins by saying, Arami Oved Avi, that my father was hounded by an Aramean who sought to destroy him. That's at least one translation. We won't go into the other pshat. Vayered Mitzrayim, and he went down to Egypt, and he was there, very small in number. And then he became a very multitudinous nation. But then the Egyptians afflicted us, and we cried out to God. And God saw our affliction and our servitude, and God took us out of Egypt with great miracles. And he has brought us to this amazing place, this land flowing with milk and honey. And it is therefore for this reason that I have brought my first fruits that you, God, have given to me. And the person must then bow down to Hashem. And in so doing, he will rejoice with all the goodness that God has given to him. And he will also share of his wealth with his family, the Levite, and the stranger in his midst. So this is what our sages called. Our sages have a very specific description of this self-reflection. It is called matchil begenutu masayim b'shevach. It is necessary in order to fulfill one's mitzvah the night of the Seder to start off with our humble origins, our really our origins that were filled with despair and squalor, and then to finish off with this great end, beautiful end of the story where we were saved and we were brought into Eretz Yisrael and we were truly, truly blessed. That's the function of what's supposed to, the mindset that's supposed to take place the night of the Seder. But as the Rambam teaches us, it is really a necessary exercise anytime a person finds himself in a position of prosperity to try to bring himself down, to refocus on the ultimate project of life, and to find humility in reflecting upon his humble origins. In general, the Torah commands us to remember the Exodus, including our being spared from the horrible plagues brought upon the Egyptians, not only to inspire gratitude to God, but also to remind us of the truth of prophecy and the concept of reward and punishment. This too is part of the objective, not only to provide us and instill us with moral virtue, but also to refocus our beliefs that the God runs the universe in a certain way. The haste of our departure acknowledges our being spared the plagues, as it says in Deuteronomy and in other places, that you have to eat matzah on Passover. Why? Ki b'chipazon yatzata me'eretz Mitzrayim, because you left Egypt in haste so that you could escape the plague of the firstborn. And the public spectacle of the plagues is explained for this reason in Parshat Bo at the very beginning, as we read about the final plagues that God brings upon the Egyptians. Why does God harden Paro's heart? Leman shitio totai elabik yirbo, so that I might place my wonders in his midst. And most importantly, in verse 2, uleman tesaper be'oznei vincha uven bincha, so that you can inform your children and your grandchildren all that I have wrought upon Egypt. And then, vidatem ki ani Hashem, you'll acknowledge that I am God. You will have an understanding about how God functions in your world. This is what is being engendered whenever a mitzvah is associated with a particular miracle, or the commandment to remember a particular miracle, like when God says, remember what God did to Miriam when you were leaving Egypt, that he afflicted her with leprosy because she spoke ill of her brother. And so by remembering that miracle, you also remember the way that God functions. He's a retributive God. He is a remunerative God, that he pays people back for what they have done, either good or bad. Thus, for example, in the context of redeeming the firstborn of human babies and sacrificing firstborn animals, which is a mitzvah that that'll be the next mitzvah after discussing the mitzvah of Bikurim, a related mitzvah of giving your first born male child to God and bringing your firstborn of your livestock as a sacrifice to God. And the Torah says, again in Parshat Bo in Exodus, that when God hardened Paro's heart, then what did God do? He smote the firstborn of the Egyptians, and therefore, to commemorate that, I must dedicate my firstborn not for death, but rather for dedication to the Lord as a sign of gratitude that God only smote the Egyptian firstborn and not the firstborn of the Jews. And now that's sort of the segue to expand to the specifics of this mitzvah of the sanctification of the firstborn animals. So the Rambam does not expand on the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben, the redeeming of the firstborn, because I guess he feels that that's self-explanatory. But he does expand a little bit on this mitzvah of sanctifying your firstborn animal. Every firstborn animal of a cow, of a sheep, of a goat, and of a donkey is automatically sanctified. And implicit in this explanation that the Rambam is giving is the question, why is this mitzvah limited to only the firstborn of cows, sheep, and donkeys? Now, Rashi asks this question as well in the Chumash. And really what the question is that this is the first time that a non-kosher animal is sanctified. It's a sort of a unique kind of commandment because we're used to sanctifying our farm animals that are of kosher species. But why is the donkey of all animals chosen as a non-kosher animal that is sanctified from the womb? And if you're going to include non-kosher animals, why specifically the donkey and not the horse or the camel, which is also prevalent in the Middle East? So Rashi answers this question. If we take a look, before we look at the Rambam's answer, let's look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Velo peter sha'ar behema tameya," but I am not sanctifying any other non-kosher animal other than the donkey. Ugezerat hakatuvhi lefi shenimshalu b'chorei Mitzrayim lachamorim, and that's because God has a special rule for donkeys because the Egyptians were like donkeys. Now, what does Rashi mean precisely over here? I think we would need some time to unpack this, which we're not going to do today. But there are many references to pagans being analogized to donkeys. The word chamor comes from the word chomer, which means physicality. It is a stubborn animal, it is a work animal, and therefore represents the entrenchment within the physical world. And it's for that reason that the Egyptians were compared to donkeys, and therefore God says to remember the plague of the firstborn. I sanctify every donkey so that you remember that the Egyptians were afflicted and your livestock, which is akin to the Egyptians, is being spared. The Rashi then gives us a second reason. He says, Va'od shesiya'u et Yisrael b'yitziatan miMitzrayim, that donkeys actually helped the Jewish people as we were leaving Egypt. She'ein lacha echad miYisrael shelo natal harbe chamorim te'unim mikaspam umizahavam shel Mitzrayim. That every single Jew who left Egypt left with multiple donkeys laden with the wealth of Egypt. And so therefore, out of a sense of gratitude to the donkey, God sanctifies every firstborn donkey. We find a similar concept with the dogs, that our sages say that out of gratitude for the dogs not barking during the plague of the firstborn in the Jewish camp, God rewards them by saying, Lakelev tashlichunoto, give dogs your carrion meat that is not kosher. But in any event, you see this idea that for Rashi at least, donkeys were sanctified either because it reminds us of the Egyptian plague of the firstborn, or it reminds us of the Exodus from Egypt, showing our gratitude to the donkey. But the Rambam's answer is much more pragmatic, is that donkeys and together with cows, sheep, are livestock that were most prevalent among our ancestors who were predominantly shepherds in the Middle East. And as the Rambam writes, horses and camels are in most cases not to be found in the possession of shepherds, nor are they found in all places. And to underscore that and to sort of prove that, the Rambam looks at the war with the Midianites just as we were about to enter the land of Israel. We were in the desert still on the Transjordan, on the other side of the Jordan, getting ready to enter in. We went to war against the Midianites, and the Torah only enumerates these three types of livestock, cows, sheep, and donkey, as the spoils of war, because the Midianites were an itinerant people. And when therefore they too were shepherds, just like the Jews of that time were. And therefore, when they went out to war with the Midianites, what did they find among their livestock? Cows, sheep, and donkeys. They didn't find horses. They didn't find camels, because people who are itinerant shepherds don't have those kinds of livestock. So that's the reason the Rambam says that God chose cows, sheep, and donkeys. When the Torah talks about the sanctification of firstborn donkeys, it gives the option of either redeeming the donkey or breaking its neck, therefore killing it. And that's in Exodus chapter 13, verse 13. So the Rambam just wants to clarify for us there's no inherent value in gratuitously killing a donkey. Rather, the commandment to break its neck is merely an incentive to redeem it onto a sheep that can then be given to the Kohen. In other words, the Torah says once that firstborn donkey is born, obviously you can't bring a non-kosher animal as a korban, as a sacrifice. So what do you do with that donkey? If it's sanctified, what use can you get out of it? You pass its holiness through a process called pidyon onto a sheep. The sheep then is sanctified. The donkey is therefore now no longer adhering with holiness. It can then be used as a regular donkey to schlep for you and to do your work for you. And the sheep is brought and presented to a Kohen as the property of the temple, so to speak. So that concludes the Rambam's discussion of first fruits and his discussion of the other first, which requires us to part with our assets, of giving of our first animals and our firstborn to God. Now let's talk about the law, another law that also engenders within the Jew proper moral virtue. And this is where we get to the laws of Shemitah and Yovel. Those of you who are following live recognize that we just read about the laws of Shemitah and Yovel this past Shabbat in Parshat Bahar. The mitzvot of not working the soil and leaving it ownerless engender compassion to the poor. Again, the same theme, enabling the poor to eat from the ownerless land. Because one of the laws of Shemitah, of the sabbatical year, is that your land not only remains fallow, but it also remains open and accessible to everyone. It is what's called hefker. It is free property. This also will allow the animals to eat freely, so it engenders compassion to animals. You know, anyone who thinks that Judaism does not support compassion to animals, just look at what the Rambam writes as far as why God says that the Torah says that the field must be open to your animals as well. So that's the first benefit. The second benefit is that by leaving the land fallow, the earth becomes more fertile. And that's something that a number of commentaries point out, is that Shemitah has an agricultural benefit, which today farmers call crop rotation. You rotate your crops from one part of the land to another to allow the land to rest and replenish its nutrients. So the Torah says, do that for the entire land of Eretz Yisrael for 1 year. The land will be able to replenish its nutrients. Other mitzvah, by the way, that has nothing to do with this idea of instilling man with moral virtue, but the Rambam, because he's discussing the mitzvah, throws that in as well. And as we'll see throughout these discussions of the mitzvot, the Rambam says how the mitzvah pertains thematically to that specific category that he's addressing. But if the mitzvah has other benefits, he'll address that as well. Now, other mitzvot associated with Shemitah and Yovel also engender compassion to slaves and other kinds of poor and underprivileged classes of people. So, for example, the cancellation of debts that takes place at Shemitah helps the person who has gotten himself too far into debt. The freeing of slaves that takes place once every 50 years at the Jubilee year at Yovel also gives an opportunity for people to find redemption and to pull themselves up. Associated mitzvot also protect individuals' financial stability. the law that all land must go back to its ancestral owner at Yovel. When you sell a piece of property in Eretz Yisrael, in most situations, that property goes back to the seller at the time of Yovel. And the reason for that mitzvah is that this allows one's ancestral property to be preserved for himself and his children and allows him to live off of its produce. So once again, the Torah is showing how we have to practice the virtue of compassion to make sure that no one becomes destitute among our people. Even though the Torah is not a socialist system, but it's a free enterprise capitalist system, nonetheless, there are certain commandments that are built in to the social order that try to act as a safety net to prevent people from falling into absolute abject poverty, and the Shemitah and Yovel laws are included in that category. And so the Rambam says we have thus explained that almost all the laws contained in Hilchot Zera'im, the laws of agriculture, have a common theme. The only exception to this is the law which prohibits the interbreeding of animals, something which we call Kil'ei Behema. In a previous chapter, we talked in chapter 37, we talked about Kil'ei HaKerem, why the Torah prohibits mixing seeds together, which is a form of paganism. And later on, says the Rambam, we'll talk about Kil'ei Behema, the prohibition of crossbreeding animals, which is not under this particular fourth category out of the 14, because it doesn't engender moral virtue. But we'll explain that in a later chapter, in chapter 49, which when we get to the end of the 14 categories. Now we're going into outside of the Hilchot Zera'im, the laws of agriculture. We get to another part of the Mishnah Torah, which is called the laws of Erechin and Charamim, which these two Hebrew terms refer to donating one's value or the value of one's possession to the upkeep of the temple, which is what is called the Berek HaBayit. So at the very end of Leviticus, which we're going to be reading this Shabbat in Bechukotai, the Torah goes into an extensive discussion of Erechin, which is the law that a person who is so inspired can donate. He can say, Erechi alai, I hereby pledge my value. If I were to be sold on the slave market, I pledge that value to the temple. And that goes to the Berek HaBayit, to the temple treasury for the upkeep of the temple. Or a person can say, cherem, the value of a particular piece of property or a particular human being or an animal is now cherem to the temple, and that means that it is a gift to the Kohanim. A person always has that option of doing these voluntary gifts to augment whatever he's already obligated to give to the temple and to the priests and the Levites. This once again engenders charity, like so many of the other laws mentioned above. Man thus learns to be generous and holds property in slight esteem where God is concerned and is not miserly. Again, it promotes that eschewal or rejection of indulgence for personal gain. And as the Rambam writes, now that we've departed from the agricultural laws, the reason why the Torah adds additional laws of charity is because of us city slickers. Those of us who aren't farmers, we have the opportunity to be charitable as well. And as he writes, for most of the evils that arise among people in the cities are due only to a furious desire for possessions and for increasing them and to the passion of acquisition. So we all recognize that that's a vice that most people have, even those who aren't farmers, that we want, yesh lo mana rotzeh matayim, as the Talmud says. If a person has 100, he immediately wants 200. If he has 200, he immediately wants 400, and so on. Included in this category, now we go on to the next category of mitzvot, the laws of loans. All of them, all of these laws, including the laws against charging interest, are designed to engender benevolence and pity and to be kind to those less fortunate. And therefore the Torah commands me, if you have the ability to do so, lend another Jew in need, give him a loan. Instead of just charity, make sure that he's provided for. They further prohibit the lender from taking any collateral that is needed by the debtor for his sustenance, such as his millstone. The Torah is very careful and says, while every lender has a right to secure a loan by demanding some collateral, that collateral item must not be so vital to the existence of the borrower that if I take that collateral from him, he won't be able to make any money. So, for example, the person who I've lent money to is a miller, a person who mills grain and turns it into flour. I'm not allowed to take his millstone as collateral because that'll preclude him from being able to make a parnasa, and it'll continue his cycle of poverty. The next category are the laws Hilchot Avadim, the laws of owning slaves. These too engender benevolence to the weak, where the Torah restricts how I may work a slave and requires me to treat the slave with compassion and with dignity. An example is where the Torah frees a Canaanite slave if one of his limbs is severed in the course of his servitude, thus preventing enslaving someone once they've been mutilated. The Torah gives the example of a slave who loses merely a tooth or an eye, but how much more so does it apply to other more significant losses of limb? And this is per the Talmud in Tractate Kiddushin, which says that Esrim va'arba'a rashei avarim shebadam. There are 24 tips of the limb that if a person loses a finger, a hand, a foot, God forbid, in the course of labor, they are immediately set free. And the Torah only gives the example of losing a tooth or an eye, but how much more so does that apply if a person loses a more vital organ? Another example of how we must show respect and dignity to the slave is the prohibition to strike the servant with anything larger than a small stick, and in general to be compassionate with one's servants. The Rambam actually does not expand on this idea. I don't know where he gets this idea of a small stick from. I haven't had a chance to research it properly, but he does have a very interesting, almost sermonic message in the Mishneh Torah in talking about how we must deal even with the Canaanite slave with tremendous dignity and compassion. So the first thing the Rambam says is mutar, and this is in the Laws of Slaves, chapter 9, halacha 8. Mutar la'avod be'evid kanani befarech. It is permitted to impose very hard labor on a slave. Ve'afal pi shahadin kach, but even though the law allows for that, midat chasidut v'darkei chokhmah, it is nonetheless considered to be an act of piety and also an act of wisdom, adam rachaman v'rodef tzedek, that a person should be merciful and try to always do the right thing, v'lo yachbid ulo al avdo, and not to place an excessive yoke of burden upon his servant, and not to cause him any kind of pain, and to feed him, and to give him to drink from whatever food that the master is eating and drinking from. And the earlier rabbis used to give all mikol tavshil v'tavshil shahayu ochlin. They used to provide their servants with whatever they themselves were eating. If they were having a steak dinner, their slaves also got steak dinners. Umakdimin mazon habeimot v'avadim l'sudat. That's one. And furthermore, they would not eat themselves until making sure that both their livestock and their servants had first been fed. Aharehu omer ke'enei avadim el yad adonehem ke'enei shivcha el yad gevirta. That, as scripture even points out, we, the Jewish people, are supposed to view ourselves as God's servants, and just like a servant turns with a sense of longing and submission to their master in the hopes that their master will be merciful upon them, that's how we look at God. And if so, we must model that behavior to our own servants. It is therefore prohibited to say any disparaging word to one's servant, to insult them, to make them feel bad. And by the way, this is very important, even though we don't have slaves anymore today, but we have workers, we have employees, we have people who work domestic help that work in our home. We have people who are our employees if we own a company or a business, and we have to make sure that whatever we say does not violate this precept. V'lo yarbe alav tza'aka v'kas. It is prohibited to scream or to express anger at a slave. Ela yedaber imo benachat v'yishma ta'anotav. But you have to speak with him gently. Listen if he has a grievance. Okay? And he says, Ve'ein ha'achzariyut v'hazut mitsuya ela ba'akum ovdei avodah zara. The only time that cruelty is and impudence is prevalent is not within the Jewish people, but rather with pagans. Avol zar'o shel Avraham Avinu, But the descendants of Abraham, our father, Vehem Yisrael Shishpilam HaKadosh Baruch Hu Tovat HaTorah, referring to the Jewish people, who are the beneficiaries of this tremendously wise and grooming Torah that provides us with such proper pedigree and behavior. V'tziva otam bechukim u'mishpatim tzadikim rachmanim heim al hakol. Jews, because they possess the laws of the Torah, understand what moral virtue is, and we share this virtue and this proper behavior with everyone with whom we interact. And God further commands us to resemble him in any way that we can. And if God is merciful to all his creations, we must be merciful as well. So even though the Rambam here in the Moreh Nevukhim only talks a little bit about the compassion we must show to our servants, here's a great example from the Mishnah Torah about how the Rambam expands on this idea. And it's a very humbling prospect, because if we were to think about this paragraph in Hilchot Avadim, we would certainly be humbled in sometimes thinking about how we abuse other people in our workspace. We have to be very careful about that. We go on, and the last thing that we're going to be discussing today is the law of offering sanctuary to an oppressed slave. And this too is a mitzvah that's contained in the Torah. It's part of Hilchot Avadim, of the laws of slaves, but it's a special case law that if a slave runs away from an oppressive master that is not me, and he runs onto my property seeking sanctuary, I have a commandment, as per Deuteronomy 23, to make sure that he is provided for, and I'm not allowed to give him back to his master if I perceive that he has run away because of oppression, because of undue oppression upon the slave. Now, you have the verses there in front of you on the, I'm sorry, I won't read from them right now, but the Rambam wants to explain this mitzvah. Beside the standard engenderment of compassion, this mitzvah also engenders within us a value of offering sanctuary to someone in need so that we can protect them from their oppressor. This is a special case of compassion, of when someone comes to you for help and they need your protection, you help them with protecting them. It is not enough to merely offer that person sanctuary. One is obligated to take care of his every need and to make sure not to offend him even verbally. And so what the Rambam says is very similar to what he wrote in Mishnah Torah. If the Torah is so concerned about the protection of the lowest class of society, i.e. the slave, how much more must we be careful about offering protection to people of greater importance? And how sensitive must we be to those who are experiencing trouble or travail? But we should not be morally confused, and this is what we'll finish with for today. The Rambam at the end of this chapter says, don't be morally confused to offer protection to a wicked person who seeks our protection. And here, my friends, I'm going to have to get a little bit on the soapbox before we finish for today. Look at the very crazy and morally confused world in which we live today, right? The Palestinians under the leadership of Hamas have wrought terrible, terrible cruelty upon the people of Israel. And then when Israel brings retribution upon them in the guise of war, the world then cries out and says, show compassion to the oppressed, right? It's like the child who murders his parents and throws himself to the mercy of the court. And the Rambam says that's moral confusion. If you have compassion to someone who is a criminal, who is evil, and wreaks havoc in society, and then asks you for sanctuary and protection. To the contrary, the Rambam says, no matter how important the person is, if he is deserving of retribution because of his evil, the Torah says, you must take him even if he takes hold and clings to the altar itself. You have to pull him out of the temple, pull him away from the altar, and bring him to punishment. If this is true of a person who seeks sanctuary in the temple by holding on to a holy artifact, it is certainly true if a person merely seeks sanctuary by holding fast to a human being seeking their protection. And this is because the Rambam says, pity for wrongdoers and evil men is tantamount to cruelty with regard to all creatures. The Rambam is really quoting, in a way, from a midrash, the midrash in Kohelet Rabbah, reflecting on the life of King Saul and his tragic error of having compassion on an evil man, Agag of Amalek. The Midrash says, "Kol mi shenaseh rachaman b'makom achzari," anyone who is merciful at a time when he is meant really to be cruel and to be retributive to an evil person, sof shenaseh achzari b'makom rachaman, will eventually become cruel in a place where he needs to be merciful. And many times, compassion is really cruelty to the person who is innocent. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the world today. The world would rather be compassionate to Hamas and be cruel to the Jewish people because of the latent anti-Semitism that is rampant in the world today. Um, it's very, very painful. But you see that this idea that it exists within society, not just directed against the Jewish people, but in general, to give sanctuary to someone who is a criminal is not something that the Rambam says the Torah sanctions. When that slave runs away and he seeks your protection, it's because you can tell that he's being tortured and afflicted by his master. That's why you give him protection and sanctuary. But if a person's a criminal, he's broken out of jail, you don't give that person sanctuary. You report him back to the police so that society can be protected. And the Rambam wrote this as well in chapter 35. I refer you back. We talked a little bit about this when we were in the Pines edition on page 536. No one is as weak-minded as those who deem that the abolition of punishments would be merciful on men. On the contrary, this would be cruelty itself on them, as well as the ruin of the order of the city. And in the next chapter, in the next few chapters, 40 to 42, we will learn all about the Rambam's explanation as why the Torah designs certain laws having to do with tort law, having to do with laws of damages, and the laws of having to properly deal in the financial arena, the laws what we call chosh and mishpat. That's going to be the next three categories of law. And the Rambam concludes the chapter by saying, in sum, these mitzvot detailed in our chapter contain laws that promote moral quality. These are not the same moral qualities as the foolish nations, who will proudly offer sanctuary to anyone who seeks their aid, regardless of whether the person is the perpetrator or the victim. They rather hold this value of offering sanctuary as being praiseworthy without any distinction, as is known from their stories and poems. And Rav Kafich says that the Rambam is referring to Arabic tribes known to flourish during his period, who had stories and tales about offering sanctuary to anyone without asking any questions. That already is what causes civilization to run amok. So I think we'll hold it here for today. Anyone have one final question you want to post in the chat? I so oftentimes someone tries to ask a question, but I don't always hear the question for whatever reason. Um, in any event, it's getting late. So let me wish you a wonderful week, and we will, Be'ezrat Hashem, resume this next week as we get closer and closer to the holiday of Shavuot and the receipt of the Torah. Let us pray and hope, dear friends, that our hostages are delivered very, very soon, and that this war comes to an end, and that there is peace throughout the land. Have a wonderful day.